Pleased to be back as a chair for this last part of the day, the last sessions of the day. And we are going to start with hearing back from the rapporteurs on your discussions and during the parallel sessions. I think if we could put the sessions, the titles of the sessions on the screen. If not, we're going to start right away with the first parallel session, the rapporteur from the first parallel session, which was entitled, How Should We Measure the Hidden Dimensions of Poverty? So, comment mesurer les dimensions cachées de la pauvreté? And we have as rapporteur Ides Nikes, who is going to in 5 minutes, and I'll be very strict, we'll summarize the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have no intention whatsoever to give you a complete account of what we discussed, because it was, overall, I must admit, a rather chaotic discussion. I think other members of the discussion also admitted that, which does not mean that it was not rich, but it went in many different directions. Let me just highlight 3 points. One is the key question about the interest of building a global set of poverty indicators, which is an enormous challenge, because we are living in very different worlds. There's divides between the North and the South, that there's all sorts of cultural divides. Maybe I should also mention that the point was not coincidentally raised by someone, an academic living on an island, namely Great Britain, who challenged the rest of the world and say, do we need a common set of indicators on poverty? So we discussed all these differences and commonalities between countries, but in the end, I think we agreed that, there might be some differences in mainly in the degrees of poverty across the world. Maybe the dimensions even of material deprivation would not differ too much between the different parts in the world. At least the ambition was to find common dimensions, and they were identified. There might be differences in degree, in depth of poverty, of course, across the world. But on the other hand, there was also agreement that in the more hidden dimensions of poverty, the psychological and the relational dimensions, the indicators may reveal much more similarity between the North and the South. So this might be a step forward in reaching more agreement on poverty indicators. Marco from the OECD, I don't know whether he's still in the room, insisted that according to his experience, international indicators, and the ones that we are discussing here, have an enormous impact on policies, because countries are comparing themselves to the rest of the world. They learn from each other when they use common indicators. They learn from each other. And also, they don't want to be blamed and make more efforts to combat poverty when they are in the spotlights in international tables. So there's definitely a very big interest in having these common indicators. A second set of discussion points revolve around the question, what is the novelty of this ATD research here? Obviously, there are some very interesting dimensions and even sub-dimensions when we speak, for example, about social violence and institutional violence. These dimensions are to many people new, not necessarily to academics. Here it was Nicolas Duvaux, a French academic, who said, well, this sounds rather familiar to us. In sociology, we have been talking about institutional violence for several decades already. And I think we must admit that we are not reinventing the wheel with this ATD research. But there were some very interesting further thoughts about how this institutional violence interacts with social violence also in deprived environments and so on. We discussed issues like cultural poverty, what that means. It has different sub-dimensions, like in the first place, access or lack of access to cultural services. And secondly, also the suffering from value systems in society at large, the perception of poor people by the rest of society, and the values of solidarity versus exclusion that go together with that. So there's a lot to be taken home from here. Now the claim by Nicolas that many things in this ATD research sound familiar to him, I think we should not overestimate it. I think he is a sociologist in the first place. He's not representative of the entire academic community. He's probably not even a mainstream sociologist, and he's definitely not a policymaker. And I think the main novelty of this research is that it is policy-oriented and that it provides or aims to provide, say, at least a grid to develop indicators for policymaking. And in policymaking, it is extremely important to have the right indicators to assess and evaluate the impact of policies. Otherwise, we have biased evaluations, and maybe we tend to take measures that go against the interests of people experiencing poverty. Moreover, a purpose of the meeting was definitely also to find commonalities and not to say that the ATD research has reinvented the world. Finding commonalities we did to some extent, not just with academics, but also with the OECD. And one very practical pathway for further collaboration emerged between the ATD team and the OECD team working on indicators of well-being. This was repeatedly mentioned. Last point is that the research gave voice to people experiencing poverty, but one of the novelties of the research is probably that it aims to give respondents in further surveys more voice about their perspective on the world and how public services, for example, are treating them, whereas in the past many poverty indicators collected some factual information about the poor without necessarily collecting their perceptions and appreciations of their situation. That's it for our workshop. I hope that it more or less gave you the highlights.
Thank you very much. We are going to move straight away to the rapporteur of the second session, which title was "What are the methodological and epistemological innovations of the project compared with other participatory approaches?" And we have Marion Carrel to report. Thank you.
Oui, donc, well, I offered up two things which I thought were very important regarding methodological innovation and epistemological innovation. The first is the issue of conditions to avoid inequalities being reproduced in participative research. Because we've seen that it's not simply enough to sit around a table to ensure that equality simply springs forth all of a sudden. And so amongst the methodological tools used, there are things which allow us to tease out a knowledge which was perhaps ignored or invisible amongst groups of peers. And these are safe areas, as feminists call them, which allow us to build knowledge based on experience, and after that it can be compared with others. And then there's a whole series of things which take a lot of time. National teams made up of 3 types of players: professionals who know how to work in the field, researchers who have academic knowledge, and people living in poverty who have experience of poverty. And in each country, a huge amount of work is being done to tease out this knowledge and to merge it. In Bolivia, for example, that involved 167 people in 17 peer groups, and then this group work at the national level, research at national level, and then emerging at international level amongst the 6 countries. What's striking is the time that it takes, the preparation it requires, the tools to facilitate this, which allows them to ensure or to try and ensure equality with feedback from the peer groups in real time if necessary. And the difference between this and most other forms of participative research, well, it's all about truly participative research from the very beginning to the end, right up until the co-drafting, the co-writing. So that was the first thing. Second thing is this dual dimension that this offers: scientific on the one hand and democratic on the other. They may actually be entwined. I have the impression that this afternoon we actually discussed them together, the scientific and the democratic sides. Now, for the scientific element, well, providing new knowledge, that was just discussed, and the idea of going to look for invisible, ignored knowledge by talking to the poorest, that offers something. Thanks to merging of this with other forms of knowledge, this offers questions or puts words into situations and problems and offers questions up to the scientific community. Some may know of these, of course, but it seems to me that when it comes to the dimension mentioned this morning, unrecognized contributions, I'm not sure that a sociologist like myself, alone in their office, would actually have access to all of the knowledge provided in that particular mixed team regarding what an unrecognized contribution might be. How is it unrecognized? Why? And how can it be recognized? And so the person living in poverty said just earlier on, I experienced things, I saw things, and now, after all I've experienced in this merging, I can say something about what I live. That's social mistreatment or maltreatment, putting words onto experiences and publishing it. Democracy, that's the issue of equality, in debate, discussions, conflict. We haven't talked much about conflict, but it seems to me that the issue of democratic conflict in this type of research is important, and it can bring us to scientific conflict when we have this famous triangulation of methods. When there are groups providing different forms of knowledge and they don't agree, well, we are there talking about democratic conflicts, and these are things which are all about collective intelligence and development of agency, particularly for professionals and researchers for whom this is particularly important. I have to wrap up, I can see, so there are perhaps 3 questions which could be asked regarding the limits. First of all, how can we develop this kind of method, which requires a lot of time, facilitating know-how, as ATD has? How can we disseminate the experiences that we're living in mini groups throughout society? How can we experiment on a broader basis? And lastly, what legitimacy can we give to the policy deciders, the politicians, and shouldn't we develop research regarding merging of knowledge with elected representatives, policymakers, statisticians? And to finish, there can be no democracy if part of the population doesn't have its rights recognized and doesn't have the right to speak out or be heard. And there can be no fully fledged science if some of the knowledge is ignored. So this brings us to the question of decolonizing our methods of research, as some people call it. But probably I think we need plurality, scientific plurality. We need qualitative and quantitative. But we also need academic research and participative research, truly participative research, such as what we've talked about today.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very interesting summary, which I think suggests that we look at those three specific issues that you mentioned at the end. I think that's very important. Now, the third group, or the third parallel session, looked at the implications of this research for public agencies, in the sense of public institutions, and government actors or players, which might, in a sense, respond to your third question. So that's a nice move into this third session. And it's Romini Borini who's going to be doing this.
Important questions for the Inclusive Growth Initiative that actually seeks to promote a new model of growth that is there actually to reduce inequalities and not exacerbate inequalities. So I wanted just to say, before I go to the results of the highlights of the session, that interestingly, in the Inclusive Growth Initiative right now, we actually is really looking at the social and relational dimensions of inequalities and poverty, and this is not something that the OECD has done too much before. So it is, I would say, for us, pretty much the frontier, and so that's why I think that actually the conference today is particularly timely, and the session that I attended was, in fact, very rich and very useful, I think, for informing our future work in this area. So the thinking in the session was actually articulated around three sets of ideas. The first was looking at the features of policies and programs that may discourage use by poor people of public policies or social policies and use of public services. In fact, one very striking point is that to start with, if you look at the statistics, there is quite low uptake for social benefits. In a lot of countries, this is a problem. In France, for instance, only 36% of people entitled to the Revenu de Solidarité Active, which is a sort of in-work welfare benefit, actually did not receive it that measure in 2018. Sorry. So it's quite a lot, actually, of those that should receive it that don't receive it. So we can actually ask why this is the case. And this is really very much, I would say, a lot of the discussion that we had trying to explain what are those barriers, where those barriers come from. And what we discussed was that poverty creates profound social and psychological barriers, and a lot of those actually have a very human and emotional sort of dimension. And so we highlighted that the experience of disempowerment is really one of the main barriers to the use of social services. And one of the sort of common characteristics is really the loss of the sense of agency and loss of sense of dignity. And this is certainly things that resonate, I think, with the discussion we had this morning. But maybe a more sort of striking and quite surprising fact that we learned about was it looks like public administration social programs that actually are intended, are there to help the poor, they seem to be almost designed or built in with characteristics that prompt disempowerment. And so really creating forms of institutional maltreatment. So for instance, we talk about subjugation, the idea of confiscating the power to take decision. Somebody noticed that it looks like poverty is seen as structural power over people. Some of the public policies, in fact, were described like intrusive and policies that actually put a lot of distance, that prompt the feeling that one's right and competence are actually denied. And other mentioned expert bias in the sense that very often complex individual situations need to be made to fit into programs that actually are very rigid and designed by others, and sometimes designed by experts that don't really understand the experience of poverty. The other big barrier is in fact the complexity, the complex design of public services, and also the fragmentation in the delivery. And this is particularly a serious issue for those in very vulnerable situations that need to go, in fact, to ask for different services. We talk a lot about the fact that in a lot of countries, in the US and the UK in particular, I think we had a couple of experiences being related, it looks like we have seen, in fact, public policies becoming excessively restrictive, putting degrading conditions for accessing benefits, meaning that essentially they are heading a lot of conditionalities, requirements. And so these essentially are restricting the rights and the access to those policies. So there is obviously, a major implication for that is how eligibility criteria are, decided. And something that was said by the group is that it would be obviously very important that these are carefully assessed in order to ensure that those eligibility criteria do not actually enforce barriers and are not being used as instruments of discrimination. The second set of aspects that we discussed was around what sort of lessons we can draw from the ATD project, and in particular how we can make public institutions more responsive to the needs of the most vulnerable people. I would say the broad answer to that question was that social policies and programs need to be more people-centered, and this is certainly something that we would highly subscribe from the Inclusive Growth Initiative work. But what it means, this is something we discussed quite a lot in depth, I would say. First of all, that should mean that the user's experience of poor must be improved, and also that social services and programs must adapt. One of the most important aspects is that those policies really need to embed empathy and active listening to the experiences of poor people. So that implies a strong recognition of people's stories, so what has brought them here, for instance, a recognition of their competencies and capabilities. These people have obviously essential knowledge of their present situation and needs. They are the best, those that have that best knowledge, and also recognition of the goals and aspirations, so where they want to go and what they want to achieve. And somebody, I think that was the person from the US, started by saying that, or maybe it was UK, sorry, if I don't remember exactly, but so this person said that poverty kills dreams and kills aspiration. I think this is something that is so important, and we should certainly remember that all the time when we're talking about how we have to build social policies. Then the other principle was obviously the importance of giving, people, and in particular the most vulnerable people, a voice. So they have to be given a voice in the design of policies. Moran Roberts from ATD, for instance, said, these people need to be heard, to be listened to be involved as partners. That's the only way they can really be equals, and that is the only and true meaning of inclusion. We talk about the fact that to help individuals is very necessary to strengthen communities, so social connections. These are essential resources for well-being and inclusion, because isolation brings disempowerment and despair. We talk about things such as how policies should be evaluated and when all those principles should actually be incorporated. And the group said that it is important not only that these policies should be sort of multidimensional policies in the sense that different sort of actions and measures should integrate those principles together in an integrated way, but also that it's important to sort of consider those elements at each stage of the sort of policy cycle. So when the policies are sort of ex ante sort of evaluated, then we are implemented, and after when they are sort of assessed and sort of some lessons are taken around sort of the effectiveness of those policies. We mention actually skills as a key element in public sector innovation. So more humane public policies and services means equipping civil services with the right skills. We're not talking about the standard sort of stats of skills, but really these are skills in terms of understanding what's going on. So again, empathy, relational skills. Many discussants mentioned several initiatives that actually aim at training social workers, introducing concepts such as multidimensional poverty, but also, training programs for teachers in some cases, for social services, for job centers. Somebody also said, this sometimes is not a question of top-down trainings. It's not about, teaching things, but really creating the space, for actually establishing a dialogue where also people can mobilize different sort of knowledge. We talk about the importance of promoting approaches of social policies and public services delivery that encounter the vulnerable physically in places where the vulnerable live, but also psychologically. And finally, about the importance of changing the narratives on poverty and exclusion. And that is very essential to reduce disempowerment and stigma. So we were talking about, to what extent poverty is a choice, and there's been a lot of interesting work done by some behavioral economists that actually, really were demonstrating that poverty is certainly not a choice. And, those ideas of deserving, not deserving, these are certainly not very useful ideas in this field. And one of the participants in our session said, poor people often have to make the best choice among bad options. And so really understanding the challenges people living in poverty face and helping them overcome these challenges, that should be the main objective of social policy. And certainly this is, I think, one of the main takeaway for the OECD after this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romina. Another rich session. And I think, Xavier, you said that the research was not covering the actions and policies, but I think obviously some of the sessions will give you a lot of food for thought for this leg of the research, if the research continues in this area. Donc, la quatrième session était sur les...
The fourth session was on the implications of the project for civil society and for civil society organizations. I'd like to give the floor to Roberto Vicio.
The session was chaired by David Donoghue, and I think that after having led 193 countries to agree on the 2030 agenda, to lead a room for 40 people was like very easy for him, because we could quite easily reach to what I think are very good, important conclusions. But Ambassador Donoghue reminded us of the agenda, the principle to leave no one behind, but also the principle embedded that we need to reach those farther behind first. And first meaning here a chronological approach, which in a sense means we are already 3 years late in trying to get those farther behind, or something is happening that I'm not aware of. Now, it was also made clear that in the 2030 agenda, everything is connected. Poverty is connected to health, is connected to food, is connected to the condition on women, etc. So the interlinkage and the synergies was one of the aspects that we commented. And of course, the many dimensions of poverty were reaffirmed, and Ambassador Donoghue challenged civil society to press precisely for a more holistic understanding of poverty. The first reaction to that was from the research team that gave us this excellent report. And the research team summarize 3 recommendations. First one is one of more synergy, which is needed between the international and the local, between international institutions, funds, and NGOs and the local grassroots organizations that are where the people living in poverty are, and that are not working together or in synergy enough. There was also an important point being made for civil society and for the grassroots organizations of their need for more flexibility, more capacity to determine their own projects, more capacity to control themselves, their own activities. It was emphasized that precisely because they're in the ground and in direct contact with the people living in poverty, they frequently know better the situation and they know better the solutions, but in their activities they are frequently constrained by project framework, by logical framework, by conditions from the donors, by the authorities at all levels that don't really allow the civil society organizations to actually do what they need, what they know needs to be done. And the third recommendation is that the conditions to participate need to be created. Transformation, a transformative agenda means participation beyond consultation. Consultation is of course very important, but it's not enough, and participation is needed beyond that. Now those recommendations were there commented by the representative of the trade unions at the OECD, and he contributed an element of saying that the problem of inequalities is now not just a concern of the poorest people or of those left behind, but it's also increasingly a concern of the middle classes that feel similarly excluded from decision-making or the attention of the authorities. Empowerment is to be put at the center, but the empowerment doesn't mean or should not mean empowerment of the individual, as frequently is understood by international organizations, but a collective empowerment, which is a dimension that frequently disappears from the programs. The cultural dimensions were also emphasized, and that came again and again through the conversation. Caritas France reacted by talking about how a big NGO based, as its name says, on charity and the perception that there are people needing help is understanding the bravery that is shown by those people, the bravery against stigmatization, to combat prejudice, and to demand policies at all levels. Big NGOs face a dilemma because they are sometimes in the middle between the government and the people that the policies want to reach. But what happens when these policies do not engage people enough? What kind of partnership needs to be established with public policies? And she said that they want to be an uncomfortable partner in that keeping the critical view of the government policies, and also bringing a government challenge to the organizations themselves. How much the people that were intended to be helped actually participate in the decision-making and the policy-making of those organizations, of those civil society organizations that claim to help them. And that's a very important question for civil society overall. During the debate, a lot was being said about participation, a lot was said about the common experiences of poverty and exclusion in the North and in the South. People living in poverty in the North and in the South tend to refer to their own situation around non-material dimensions of shame, exclusion, discrimination. Now, this is a challenge for statisticians, I think. How do we measure those aspects, those intangible aspects, if they are essential to the actual perception of poverty by the people that are suffering from it? And this is my own thinking about that, Wall Street values intangibles in a way that the biggest companies of the world right now, in terms of capital, do not have factories, bricks. They have patents, databases, knowledge. If that can make for the biggest companies in the world, why cannot we measure intangibles such as shame, exclusion, lack of dignity? And of course, human rights approach came into that. Principles on poverty and human rights frequently being ignored. Principles on business and human rights and are also not taken enough into account. Again, my own question is, if we measured human rights, would some of the countries that are currently put as examples of poverty reduction still be an example? That's a question. But in that question, we need to challenge the model of growth itself and understand that the kind of disempowerment happening now is not just, although it is certainly primary, a problem of the people living in poverty, but a problem of the majorities of the people all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so I'm giving the floor directly to Rachel to summarize the discussion on for the fifth parallel session on poverty as defined by children and elders, and the evidence based on evidence from Bangladesh and Tanzania. Rachel?
Thank you, Martin. I shall try to be quick, and our session was a little different in the sense that we came to it to learn, because the work with children and older people is not represented in the report that you all have. It's very fresh, it's very new, and we took time to share from the two countries, that Bangladesh and Tanzania, how the work was done and what the main findings were. We realized that we were pushing the merging of knowledge process to a new frontier, if you like. This is not something that has been done with ATD Fourth World colleagues or partnerships elsewhere or previously in terms of engaging children and young people and older people in this systematic way. So we recognized the bravery and courage of the teams and their sensitivity to that process. It was not a full merging of knowledge process for reasons that we explored in our group. You can imagine that the power dynamics that come with age differences make that process quite challenging. A lot of strides were made significantly in terms of our tentative findings, and they are tentative because it's only in the last 3 days that the two countries have been able to meet together and compare and contrast, are that many of the dimensions of poverty are the same as those that we heard about this morning, as defined for working age people, both nationally and internationally. So social maltreatment, institutional maltreatment are as important in children and young people's lives as in working age people. And that children too show bravery and solidarity and courage with their families and friends to survive and thrive and keep courage. It's also important to note that children and older people identified experiences of poverty that practitioners and academics had not recognized as part of their lives, even those who work on a day-to-day basis with children. And particularly for children, in the case of children, sometimes it was thought that children were fabricating these aspects of their lives, and they weren't thought to be true. So we can see how important it is to engage children. It's an ambitious enterprise to engage in the way that we believe is important through this joint constructive listening and analytical thinking, because they're further disempowered by cultural beliefs that children might know less or are unable to analyze, and therefore may be further pushed to the margins. One of our contributors mentioned the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child and the importance of participation in there. And we mentioned the fact that you know, there are scales of participation, and that if we're looking for something towards the top end of that scale for reasons of co-construction, of actually wanting to co-design policies and co-design improvements to service provision, which is something that the OECD are very concerned about at the moment as well, then actually we need not to be aiming at the bottom of that ladder, but we needed to be aiming towards a model that is like merging of knowledge. That's the principle. That it needs to be very proactive and done very thoughtfully in order to be ethical, sensitive, and rigorous. In terms of some of the findings around dependency, on the one hand, for children, and to a degree for older people because of being economically dependent on families, we can see there were some parallels at being sort of structurally at this generation or this generation. Yet there's a sort of a double edge to the sword here, because on the one hand, they're dependent and limited in being able to go and look for solutions independently. On the other hand, they're being looked to, both children in terms of looking after younger siblings, etc., to care for their families and to help keep the family together, where working age adults are in poverty. And for children, particularly, this is a serious compromise to their own development. As we heard earlier, poverty kills dreams, and that came out very, very clearly around children's understanding of the compromises of their current educational experience and what that would mean for their ability to move out of poverty. They're extremely aware of what they're missing out on, put it that way. Lastly, I wanted to say we identified some very practical links in terms of moving forward around the interlinkages between dimensions and how these can further intensify the experience of poverty. We are very encouraged to hear about the work in the OECD Employment, Labour and Social Affairs Directorate. Olivier Thévenot shared this with us. The work that's being done to look at the social and emotional consequences of poverty for children and older people in relation to material deprivation. And we had a nice little exchange about maybe the word consequences may not be the appropriate one here. We've just been hearing that actually these social and emotional aspects of poverty are part and parcel of poverty. It's not necessarily a one-way relationship. It's very much an interlinkage. And we were thinking about some of the measures that are being developed in OECD to look at these in terms of cognitive development and also in terms of looking at neighborhood level interactions. There was a suggestion made that some of the work that ATD Fourth World does practically on the ground in terms of cultural activities and street libraries that are very much neighborhood based could form a context in which engagement could happen in this more merging and co-constructed way around improving service delivery, for example, that would be a very tangible way forward. So our discussion was wide-ranging, and those were some of the take-homes.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think we really had, it looks like you really had in all of the 5 sessions, breakout sessions, very good discussions and a lot of takeaways. We're not going to summarize those because it's too late in the day, but we've taken, of course, good notes, and everything has been recorded anyway, so we'll be able to look again at the conversations and draw up some of the main conclusions of the sessions. Unfortunately, Gaël Giraud, the chief economist of the Agence France-Presse de Development, cannot be with us this evening. So, but in a sense, that gave us more time for reporting. So we'll tell Gaël that we missed him a lot, but on the other hand, that also gave us a little bit of time to have more substantive reporting on the sessions. So I don't think we have really time for questions, which I really regret, because during the course of the day, we never actually had the time for interacting with many of you, whom I'm sure had a lot of questions and perhaps remarks. Of course, you have Bcast. I hope you've made use of Bcast, because all the questions will be stored and looked at, and again, will inspire some of the reflections going forward. So I think it's now time for the conclusions, and I'm delighted that we have with us Isabelle Pipert-Perrin, qui est la directrice générale d'ATD Carmonde et qui va donc nous faire...
She's the general manager of ATD Fourth World, and she is going to give us the conclusions. All right, thank you very much. First of all, this is a time to say thank you very much to all of you for this very encouraging day's work. And thank you to all of those who've made it possible. Thank you to the OECD for hosting us here today. Thank you, Martine Durand, to you and to all of your friends who've supported us in this work from the beginning. You realized that this research program was very important from the outset. So thank you very much. And here we are at the OECD today. I think that in this room, you are used to welcoming people coming from a great diversity of countries. But no doubt it's somewhat more unusual to welcome to this room people who come from diverse social levels and strata. So thank you very much for hosting this event. Now, as we don't have a great deal of time, I'd like to start by thanking the people who've participated in this research over the past 3 years. Thank you to the activists who've come from the different countries involved. The knowledge that you have shared and the relevance of the results generated from this research is not something that's external or alien to your own lives. It's emerged from your own reflections, your own work, your own interaction with other people over the course of these 3 years. And these results are enriched by your sleepless nights, your worries, your fatigue as a result of the work that you have had to do. Fed by your efforts also to take care of those around you, your neighbors, to hold everything together no matter what the cost. And I'm quite sure that as you head back to your homes, you will feel even more committed after these 3 years of common collective effort, even more committed to expanding and communicating this knowledge to all of the people around you. And I think that you'll be even more committed to do everything you can to make sure that nobody around you doubts that you have an intelligence and an expertise that other people need. All of this, I think, commits us all to communicate far and wide the results of this research with a great deal of respect and acknowledgement and appreciation. It encourages us to continue to act together. And once again, thank you to all of the professionals and to the people, the field workers, as we call them in this research. Somebody said this morning, because of this work together, we have changed our practices. We've changed the way we act. And that, I think, is an inspiration to all of us. Change the way we act. Thank you to the scientists and the academics for daring to participate in this adventure, this collective research, because we didn't know where it would take us. We didn't know if it would succeed. And I'm not sure if we know exactly where it is going to take us in the future, come to that. But as we've said today, there is no doubt at all that it is highly beneficial and fruitful. Thank you very much for daring as something new, because the academic world doesn't do it enough, making enough space for people who are living in poverty to communicate their own experiences, merge knowledge with their knowledge. Now, we have a great wealth of knowledge and expertise among the poorest people of our world. We know that we haven't yet fully achieved our aims. We know that there will be questioning of the results, but we feel that research that doesn't draw on the knowledge of the poorest among us will not have that validity. It's important to merge knowledge from people living in poverty, and we've done that in France through the Center for Opportunity and Equality, and all of this work with these organizations gives us hope and support. In the research that we've shared with you today, I think it is very clear that if we don't deal with the issues of extreme poverty, we will never put an end to the dynamic that makes this a constant phenomenon in our societies. This knowledge really throws a spotlight on the fact that the great drama of poverty is exclusion. But exclusion doesn't depend on individuals. It depends on our society as a whole, the way we all act together. So we all need to change together if we want our societies also to evolve. This research shows the destructive force of exclusion. It highlights the fact that exclusion disempowers people who are living in extreme poverty, because extreme poverty goes beyond mere financial and monetary issues. Paradoxically, at the same time, this research highlights the resilience of these people who deal with poverty on a daily basis. It highlights the fact that in the most difficult of life's conditions, these people survive. They fight for their children, they fight for themselves, they fight also for other people. And this resilience is something that has often passed unrecognized and ignored. People resist, they survive, but exclusion robs their resilience of effectiveness, and that is a major injustice. Exclusion makes resistance a perpetual imperative for people living in poverty. It forces them to fight daily to find a way to live despite everything, to create a more harmonious environment. And we should all be working to construct that harmonious environment for a better world for tomorrow. This gives us a way to move forward, work for the future for our politicians, our civil societies, and the members of our society. Above all, we need to recognize resilience. We need to learn to recognize and understand it. We need to join in a struggle without taking it over, a struggle that began well before us. As Joseph Rzinski said, the poor of all times and today as well are fighting for equality for all, for justice and peace. We should join in this struggle so that it becomes the leverage for the transformation of our societies. One thing that has been said a lot today about this research is that it gives us a way of measuring poverty, and that might be right. Some new indicators have emerged, but most of the journalists, the politicians, the academics around the world continue to use monetary indicators to determine whether or not we're making progress in the fight against poverty around the world. And that is how universities and international institutions signal a significant drop in extreme poverty around the world. And yet, and as we've said a lot today, if we look at poverty in a broader sense, going beyond simple monetary indicators, we realize that poverty has actually not receded. In Western countries, the number of children taken from their parents and handed over to social services because of the consequences of poverty has not dropped. The number of young people who are continuing to drop out of school without qualifications. Many adults are forced into work against their will or are doing work that is unrecognized, and they have a significantly lower life expectancy than the national averages. On other continents, the poorest families are those who are left out of the major development programs still, and they still need to rely on their own abilities with no social safety net. And so it is essential to take into consideration the hidden dimensions of poverty in order to look the truth in the face. And at this moment in humanity, when we know that we are facing unprecedented challenges, when scientists are telling us that all of the red warning lights are flashing with regard to biodiversity, the climate, the environment, and that the time has come to act, it would be a major injustice if we let it be believed that the fight against poverty and the fight for dignity has succeeded and all the lights are green, and that we are on the right track. The future demands of us that we grasp these two challenges front on, or head on. The people and the families for whom crisis and the environmental and human disaster is a daily reality already remind us that we must assume our responsibilities for all human beings and for the entire planet, for the whole of the earth. In order to survive, we can't choose between one thing and another. We need to make sure that we need to take care of our neighbours, of our environments, of the space that we all share together. And there are people who are doing this in the worst of conditions. That is why we need the experience of these people. We need their intelligence, their resilience, their courage to meet the challenges that the world of today is facing, to give a future to humanity. We are facing critical choices today. The future of us all depends on our capacity to take responsibility for all human beings and for the whole of the earth. It depends on our ability to formulate and to implement policies and programs that place the respect for the earth and the respect for all human beings without exception at the center. And this is something that we owe to all inhabitants of the earth, to all of us. We owe it to those among us who are struck by the injustices of poverty. We owe it to young people in all avenues of life who are starting to mobilize, who are starting to organize themselves to create our common society. What are we going to do to enable these young people to be part of this understanding that involves even people living in the worst of poverty, basing the action on that collective intelligence? How are we going to make sure that everybody makes a contact with all other groups? How can we build a society based on solidarity? To do that, we need the knowledge and the analysis that people living in poverty have forged through the trials and the tribulations of a life marked by poverty. And it's in this sense that this work on the hidden dimensions of poverty constitutes an amazing tool that we should be promoting and that we should continue to work on. We're counting on all of you to do just that. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Isabelle.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, for these inspirational and yet realistic words, which give us guidance for our future work in order to improve future lives and the future of our planet. We are getting close to the end of the day. I would like to thank very warmly everyone who has participated and who has made today a success. All of the presentations, all of the documents that were prepared for today are available on the webpage that was set up for today's conference. And Rachel has told me that research carried out on children and the elderly in Bangladesh and Tanzania, research which is not included in the report that was presented today. You can find the abstract of this research in Rachel's hands. She has copies. And we can also scan the document and upload it to our website. So today is nearing a close. I think everyone can agree with me that today was very intense, many discussions, very enlightening, and I think it gave us all inspiration. Whatever our background, our knowledge, our lived experience, it gave us a possibility to open our eyes to hidden dimensions of poverty by merging our perceptions, by merging our knowledge, maybe by changing our perspectives. And I think this has all made us richer. It has all made us smarter. And I think that we now have a wealth of ideas for future work and next steps. I won't give you any details for the time being, but I'm sure that there will be a next step and that we're headed there. I'm sure that some of the ideas that were floated today will find a tangible translation in the future. Romina told us that her group working on inclusive growth has already drawn inspiration from the discussions that were held in her parallel session. Now, regarding more generally, the work of the OECD and the work on different dimensions of poverty, this debate is ongoing. I have taken contact with Jean-Luc Tavernier, with other colleagues around this room, and I think one essential, crucial point that we can take home from today's meeting is that if we want to improve our measure of poverty in order to cover the different dimensions that Isabelle covered in her speech and that we mentioned today, then we should not look towards experts who would draft new questions to add on to a list of existing survey questions. We need to look towards communities. We need to look to people themselves in order to make sure that questions are drafted properly and that we can have the real answers to these questions. I would like to thank everyone around the table, especially the participants to the study, people who have experienced poverty firsthand. Now, today was a starting point, and we will not stop there. I'd like to thank, as I've already said, all of the participants today. We were hoping to have 30 people at the beginning, and we were very surprised to see that much more people wanted to participate. And so we had to increase the size of our conference room, push the walls in order to make room for everyone. This shows how much interest this topic holds for many. I would also like to thank everyone from ATD Fourth World, everyone from Oxford University. Thanks to the country teams, each and every one of you. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for having made the trip here and presented your results. I would also like to thank the OECD staff, especially the staff in my directorate, who have worked to support you and to support the organization of this meeting. And I would also like to thank the interpreters who have helped us all day long. Thank you very much, Chair, for these kind words. I think we are closing just in time. We managed to catch up with this morning's schedule without cutting into our discussions and debates. Thank you very much. Have a safe trip home and hope to see you soon.